Today's headline is Marshall's Discovery of Gold. The subheadline says, "The story told by a man who was there. It's gold. It's gold." This article was written to the editor of the New York Sun. It says, "I see a notice of the death of James W. Marshall, who discovered gold in California, published this morning in the Sun. I became acquainted with Marshall at Coloma, California. I knew him intimately and was associated with him in business at that place, which is on the South Fork of the American River. Marshall was a native of New Jersey. Gold was discovered in February 1848 by Marshall and another man named Weimer. I have forgotten Weimer's first name. Marshall and Weimer built for Colonel Sutter a sawmill at Coloma and had it finished in February 1848. I am a stockholder in a company which now owns that sawmill. The mill had been erected at the head of a bar where the river bends around it in the form of the letter U. The mill race had been cut through the bar, and when the mill was started, it was found that the race was too shallow, and for this reason, the wheel of the mill was partially underwater. The water was shut off, and Marshall and Weimer went down into the race to ascertain where it was to be dug deeper. A point about 50 yards below the mill, they concluded, was the place which obstructed the flow of water. Here, Marshall said to Weimer, "What is that which shines just at the toe of your boot?" Weimer then picked up the shining piece, and they both thought it was a piece of brass. They began to conjecture how it was possible for a piece of brass to get into the race. From the fact that no brass had been used in the construction of the mill, and that the piece found had been worn smooth, they concluded that it was not brass, and might be gold. On that day, Mrs. Weimer was making soap, and for this purpose had made lye by leaching wood ashes. To test the metal found, Mrs. Weimer boiled it several hours in this lye, and when she removed it from the lye, it was as black as ink. These facts were stated to be by Marshall, Weimer, and Mrs. Weimer. I went with Marshall to Weimer's house to see the first piece of gold found in California, and then and there, the whole history of the discovery was talked over by all three of the persons who participated in the discovery. Mrs. Weimer then showed the piece of gold. Its weight was $7, or the value of the ounce being $16, in other words, 8 3/4 pennyweights. The form of the piece was that of a long, irregular pumpkin seed. It was still black as when taken out of the lye, except at one end where the incrustation formed by the lye had been removed. This discovery was made in February 1848, the day I do not remember. As soon as the lye tests had been made, Marshall and Weimer went into the mill race and with wooden bowls washed out some 2 or 3 ounces of gold, and Marshall carried it to Monterey to ascertain if it were gold. This was the nearest place where the means to make the test could be had. Colonel Sutter resided at his fort near what is now the city of Sacramento. He was a Swiss and a classmate of Napoleon III. One evening, when going down the Sacramento River in a steamboat, Colonel Sutter told me the story of Marshall's return from Monterey. Colonel Sutter said, "I was in bed, and it was about 2 o'clock at night. I heard someone ride up to the fort, the horse running at the top of his speed, then a banging at the gate. Then I heard the clank of the spurs on the brick floors of the fort, then a pounding at the door of my room, and when I opened the door, in rushed Marshall, shouting, 'It's gold! It's gold!' At the time Marshall and Weimer built the mill at Coloma, the labor used was Indian labor. There were no other white men besides Marshall and Weimer. Marshall was unmarried and had no children. I think Weimer had, but do not distinctly remember. When Marshall returned from Monterey to Coloma, he brought with him about 300 Indians and took to Weber Creek, distant about 6 miles from Coloma. There with his Indians, he washed out a large amount of gold. His part was sufficient to buy from Sutter the sawmill at Coloma. In 1849, Marshall and John Winter owned the mill together, and they also owned Winter's Hotel. They sold the lumber at $500 a thousand, and the demand was greater than the mill could supply. I paid at the hotel $100 a week board, without a room. Marshall was then worth more than $100,000, but his generosity was without limit. He gave to all who asked of him. He had no business qualifications, and when sharp businessmen came in and built up the little town of Coloma, Marshall was soon traded out of all his property. His money he had lent where it would never be returned, or had been given away. Then Marshall became a prospector for gold mines. Several times I fitted him out with mules, men, and provisions to go prospecting. He knew the country better than any other man at that time, and led the way to many rich placer mines, but never found any that were rich enough for him. Often as he left mines where he could take out 6 or 7 ounces per day to each man to seek an El Dorado where hundreds of thousands could be made in a week. Since 1852, I have known nothing of Marshall, but I concur in the opinion that it is a disgrace to the state of California that she has suffered Marshall to die in want. To Sutter first and Marshall next is California most indebted. This article was written by Henry C. Gardner from New York on August 13th. This story came from the great state of Ohio, being reported in the Cincinnati Commercial Gazette of August 16th, 1885. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.